Next up, please welcome to the stage Teresa Ish, the Oceans Initiative Lead and Senior Program Officer for the Walton Family Foundation. Her Excellency Mavis Hawa Koomson, the Minister for Fisheries and Aquaculture Development from Ghana, and Jim Leape, the co-director of the Woods Institute for the Environment at the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, for a conversation on sustainable fishing and food security, moderated by veteran journalist Maggie Lake.
Hello again, everyone. Super excited to have this conversation because I think, like so many of the others that have come before, we're really going to see that there is an intersection and a lot of positive momentum if we can maybe pull the lens back and look at some of the sustainable development goals in a holistic way and make sure that they're all getting the attention they need. And certainly ocean health and blue foods is right up there. So welcome to the panel. Thank you all for being here. I'm not sure if any of you had a chance to look at FP's website, but there was a story that dropped yesterday that was a really perfect backdrop and setting for the conversation that we're going to be having today. And I wanted to read you the title of it because I think it encapsulates the task ahead. And that is The Other Global Food Crisis. And the subtitle was, World Leaders Need to Care About Fish as Much as They Care About Semiconductors. Pretty eye-catching title, I thought, especially see the semiconductor reference in there. So I'd like to sort of bounce off on that. And Teresa, what do we need to understand about the reality of what's happening with our oceans and fish stocks?
Yeah, well, first off, I want to really appreciate Foreign Policy for including a session on blue foods and fish today at the Food Plus Summit, and also make the point that 20% of the animal protein consumed in the world comes from blue foods and fish. More than 3 billion people rely on fish as a significant source of protein, and a far greater number rely on fish for other essential micronutrients. So one panel is not necessarily representative of the importance of blue foods and seafood and fish in our diets and its role in global health and global food security. I think the other thing to recognize, I think we hear a lot of stories about overfishing in the ocean, degradation of the ocean. And what we also know is that when fisheries are managed for sustainability, they recover and they come back. So we really have an opportunity in this moment as we focus on the role of fish in feeding an increasingly hot and hungry planet. There is a pathway forward where we can actually produce more fish, feed more people through sustainable fisheries management and sustainable aquaculture. And that message of hope, I think, is one of the really critical things to remember when we talk about blue foods and the potential out there.
Yeah, and it's been a theme throughout the day, really. Certainly the panels that I've been on is that this is not having to invent a solution. There are solutions out there. This is really about trying to accelerate them. We heard just now in the conversation, the secretary say acceleration and getting it into the field. I mean, that's really what needs to be done, which is a perfect introduction to you, Minister, because you are certainly on the ground having to do that in Ghana. Yes. Give us an idea of how these challenges are, what they mean for Ghana, and then what you're doing. How are you approaching this issue?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I bring you warm greetings from Ghana and His Excellency, the President of the Republic, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. Yes, in Ghana, as she rightly mentioned, fish is not just part of our diet, but it's also a fundamental aspect of our culture and the identity of Ghanaians. And so we have a lot of people doing these fisheries, and the challenges that we have is the overfishing, as she mentioned. And also we have the illegal activities, unreported, unregulated fishing activities in the system. Some of the illegal activities are transshipment at sea, use of chemicals, use of under mesh nets, and also use of light to do fishing. And so we have this issue of the illegal activities, and we also have the population being more than the strength of the ocean. when we used to have about 8,000 canoes on our sea, today we have over 12,000. 12,000 canoes. And we also have the trawlers, about 76 trawlers on the sea. So it brings so much pressure on the sea. And these are some of the challenges that we face. And so what we are doing to bring these challenges down is regulating the system. How do we regulate them? By giving ministerial directives that they should use the right fishing gear to do fishing. We've also asked them to stop the transshipment at sea. We've also given the directives they used to fish for about 3 months on the sea. Now we've given them days, 30 days to fish, instead of about 90, 120 days to do fishing at sea. and we've also introduced a moratorium for the canoes. That's since the canoe used to be 8,000, now 12,000. If we don't have a cut-off point for them, it means it's going to be increasing and increasing. And so we've given them a moratorium recently that they should stop new entries. And we've also made sure that the trawlers are now having EMS, electronic monitoring device, that has cameras on them, so that we'll be monitoring their movements all through their fishing activities. We are now piloting, and so we're making sure that by come January, if you don't have these cameras on your vessels, we're not going to give you any license to do your fishing. And we also have the VMS and then AIS to do monitoring. Upon all this, we also have human, observers who are directly on the ship or the vessel to monitor their activities all day round.
There are a lot of reforms that you've put through that cannot have been easy. How has that been going, and how are you getting the various stakeholders on board? I mean, how have you been able to push it through?
Yes, it hasn't been easy, as you said, but we need to, have stakeholders consultation. We bring them on board and let them understand, because they go for fishing. At the end of the day, when they go, they come empty-handed. And, this pollution of the sea with waste is also there. So when they go, all they catch is plastic waste. And so we sensitize them, we get them to also come in with their ideas. And that is where we have the co-management measures that we bring in the fishers to also come out with their ideas and then tell us what we should do. Whilst we are educating them, we also listen to them to give us some of the directions. So we are co-managing the system. And definitely you have the recalcitrance one, but then when you get the recalcitrance ones, you need to also punish them. And that will serve as a deterrent to the others.
But it's interesting that you're really leading with the listening and co-management aspect to get the buy-in from the very beginning, because if you don't understand what's at stake, without that, I imagine it would be impossible. Exactly. So although there is some, penalty involved, it sounds like the first part of that is incredibly important. To have that local knowledge. Jim, I'm curious, when we're talking about this, it's a complex issue. As we just heard, it's livelihood. It's something in many cases that's been passed down. There's a pollution, climate aspect to it. What do we know from the science in terms of nutrition and what we need to understand about that and how the science can plug into the challenges?
No, thank you. This is an area where the science can actually help us get a new understanding of what's at stake and what can be done with these resources. And there aren't that many governments that are as advanced in their thinking about this or in action as this, as we've just heard from Ghana. And that's because in most parts of the world, we have one category. It's called fish, as if there was one fish. And in fact, there are 2,500 different species produced for food. And they vary wildly in their nutritional content, in their environmental footprint, in their opportunities for livelihoods. So first is just recognizing that diversity. The second is to realize that they're not just protein. We think of them as protein, but they are very rich in an array of micronutrients that are super important for the healthy development of children and for the health of all of us. So in many coastal nations like Ghana, a single serving of small fish caught from the ocean can provide the full recommended daily allowance for omega-3s, for calcium, for vitamin A. And that kind of opportunity is something we haven't really focused on. And so what it tells us is that, in fact, there's much more at stake here than we realized. We can't just manage fisheries as an economic resource. We have to think about all the ways in which they are important to national priorities. And that leads you to the kinds of things that the minister is talking about. And I'll add one other dimension to that, which is if you look at the system, you realize that for all our attention on big trawlers, and we have to come to grips with the damage done by big trawlers, most of the fish we eat globally is caught by small-scale fishers. And so making sure that they are brought into the system, that they are in the kind of consultation the minister just described, that they are helping to develop the solutions and are empowered to manage their resources is centrally important. So that kind of insight actually begins to help us think differently about policy and hopefully will help other countries begin to do the kinds of things that Ghana is doing.
Yeah, and I think that's important to the conversation about economics, because I think the minister really pointed out, and your point, Jim, that this is in many ways a local fishing issue, that it's hard when you're trying to manage the economics of that when you're talking about a family or a community that may rely on fishing. How do we need to think about that? And I'm assuming that community part of it is very important.
Yeah,
Teresa.
Absolutely. And the economics, I think, for many of the community-based fisheries are often unseen as well. Their subsistence, their additional fishing in addition to their other types of work that they do. But then the seafood industry as a whole, the fish that comes to our plates here in New York and in many other places in the world, that's a $500 billion industry. So there are companies, there are businesses that are large and small that all rely on a healthy ocean and healthy and sustainable fisheries for their longevity. And I think as we talk about the SDGs here, right, these fisheries are critical for alleviating poverty. They're critical for ending hunger. They're critical for biodiversity and health of the ocean. This is one of the only foods that we eat that is also directly part of our biodiversity conversations. And so the imperative to manage fisheries for sustainability, it's an equity imperative, it's an economic imperative, it's an ecological imperative. It doesn't hit just one category, but it really crosses all of our needs in achieving the SDGs and ensuring that we have a healthy ocean and a healthy planet and healthy fishing communities.
Yeah, and we just had a panel on regenerative agriculture where you saw big corporations getting involved, plugging in and funding and mitigating the risk for some of the smaller producers. And we talked about scale. It seems like some of the same problems here and the ability to participate, which is why those partnerships are so important. Because at the end, it's resiliency for the large food companies as well, even if some of the problems are based locally. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 1 in 5 fish that we eat tuna comes from Indonesia. The vessels that those fish are caught on are very small. They can be from very small community boats, and those individuals in a remote community are connected to grocery stores here. And that chain links us all and links all of our responsibility. But especially making sure that those fishers have a voice in the management of their resources and are able to ensure that they can continue to fish and can continue to provide it for us as well as their communities.
And I think there's an education all around and a responsibility to go beyond just, I think we all had that great sleeve of what was overfished when you went to a restaurant. So, stay away from Chilean sea bass now and lean into a fish you possibly have never heard of. To your point, Jim, there are a lot of them. And that's fine, but it's more complex than that. And we need to be a little bit more engaged in understanding the food supply chain. Jim, what about the innovations? How do we need to think about that supply chain? Are there things happening that can help improve that and improve what we're doing in terms of sustainable fishing? How are you thinking about that?
No, there's lots of opportunity here. So let me start where I left off before, which is there's an opportunity to bring a much deeper understanding of nutrition and the sort of opportunities for the food system into decision making. So that's one. So the kind of data that are now being collected will enable governments to make better trade-offs. Doesn't mean you stop exporting fish. Does mean you have a better sense of, okay, what are the competing uses for this resource and how do you make good decisions about it? But then as you look at some of the challenges that Teresa is talking about, one of the great advances of the last several years is a rapidly growing transparency over the fishing sector. For the first time, it is, for all of human history, been largely out of sight, right? And for the first time, we can now see fishing vessels everywhere they go on the ocean and are in a position increasingly to know what they're doing. So that's the first thing. I think second is connecting that to traceability in the supply chain, so you know that the fish you're buying came from that vessel which was fishing in this way. And so there is a growing possibility that supply chains are vehicles for fostering sustainability in a very powerful way. And then I think a next challenge is something Teresa was also alluding to, which is, okay, how do you make sure that that's a system that works for the small producers, whether they are producing for local markets or international markets, and they're not disadvantaged by a push towards sustainability? And that's more and more becoming possible. You have startups like Abelobi in South Africa who are putting a lot of power in the smartphone in the hand of a fisherman that allow him or her to manage their catch, but also to connect to markets directly and begin to thrive in a way that wasn't possible before.
That's super interesting, that ability to connect on the local level. And this is the power of mobility, right, of computing mobility. Minister, it sounds like that's very much what you've had to grapple with. You did talk about putting monitoring systems in. Does that sort of technology and ability to have more transparency into the supply chain, does that help you as you try to protect this industry and protect the ocean and the food source?
Yes, it helps you to monitor the system. And as I mentioned about the cameras, the EMS, it gives you lifetime or real fishing time. So wherever you are, you just go on your phone and you see which vessel is doing what. And so you are able to recall the vessel back to anchorage and give the person the punishment or the penalties that the person deserves. I think she was talking about varieties of fish that we have in the system. I think if we are able to also introduce this aquaculture system, it will also help reduce the pressure so much on the sea. And that brings brings me to the solving the issue of livelihood or alternative to the fishers, so that they will not always depend on the ocean. But at least they can have a way of doing rearing of the fish outside the sea whilst they are having this closed season within a month. So when they know, we normally observe the closed season in the month of July and August. So when they know within these 2 months, there will be closed season, somewhere April, they can start with the fingerlings and then start the rearing. By the time they go back to the sea, I mean, they come from the sea for the observation of the closed season. They also have something doing there, and they will always be occupied. Not necessarily only giving them the training, but also since they are more interested in the fishing aspect, you give them this alternative to also handle the fishing aspects.
Have you started to farming, basically, fish farming? Right?
Yes,
have you started to look at that, and what do you need from the private sector to help move that along?
Yes, this should be PPP, public-private initiative, so that they can drive it on for us. We have about more than 50 private fishers who are doing this for us. And government is also introducing aquaculture for food and jobs initiative. This is where we also want to bring in a lot of the youth. It can also be served as a means of a job creation to the youth. So we are trying to introduce about 15,000 of the youth into this aquaculture system. As we go year by year, it will be increasing. And the moment you introduce about 15,000 people, at that moment you are talking about around 45,000 to 60,000 people coming into the aquaculture sector. So we have started it.
Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, could I just say a word about this? Because there is huge potential for aquaculture in many parts of Africa. And here's an area where it would be very powerful for investors to come together in support of initiatives like the minister is talking about. Because we know from experience in some countries that to successfully develop an aquaculture sector, you have to be able to move on multiple fronts at once. Right? You need investments in training, help people learn how to fish farm. You need investments in infrastructure that allow fish to get to market. Mm-hmm. You need investments in value chains that provide the quality of feed and seed it takes to grow fish successfully and markets to sell it into. So you need to figure out how those pieces come together, and that will probably take different kinds of investors. But if they can join forces, then there's a lot of potential in a country like Ghana to really develop a vibrant aquaculture sector.
And this is important because we're talking about food security being paramount, right? So and youth unemployment in some cases in these areas too. So again, this is the intersection of bringing investors together. Suddenly you're solving for many problems, or you're making progress on many of the goals at once when you're thinking about this across border and not just as an ocean issue or simply even a fish issue. Teresa, the jobs, very interesting. You mentioned to me the age of the average. We talk about this sometimes in agriculture. I don't think we think about it in terms of our fishing supplies. There's a problem with labor.
Yeah, and this is another place where you have an environmental and a social component kind of colliding. In the years in the U.S. where our fisheries management was not robust and fisheries declined, it was natural if you had your kids go to college to say, get out of the fishery, find a better livelihood elsewhere. And we're seeing that happen in many places around the world where the fish stocks aren't healthy. The fishermen are told that they're contributing to the decline of the ocean. Get your kids out of college and high school, and they go and they take on different jobs, and the average age of the fishing community and fishermen in many countries is well into their 60s. I think the minister is experiencing something in Ghana that's different, but I think that's also a response to this need to find food in the presence of fish, because if there's no fish to fish, you're not going to stay in the industry. If you see growth in a fishery, you can actually enter, and you see potential, and you see a future.
Right, the problem is driving it out, driving future generations out, and that is exacerbating the problem.
Right.
So you get into a vicious loop. Jim, can we solve food security without fish? Can we solve hunger without fish? It doesn't sound like we can, based on what you said before. Because I say to my kids, the protein tonight is fish. I do that. I'm guilty of that. But it sounds like it's much more than that.
Yeah, I think it would be a big mistake to go after solving the food security problem without fish. Because in so many countries, these resources are there and accessible and affordable, and if well managed, can meet a lot of food system needs. Right? So there are lots of talk about innovations in various parts of the food space, and many will have important roles to play. But this is one that's already at the heart of the food system and clearly has the potential to be an increasingly important part of meeting food system priorities in many, many countries.
Why do you think it doesn't get as much attention?
Well, I think it's partly some of the things we talked about. It is fish are sort of out of sight, out of mind. Right? I mean, we all see farms. We don't really get much visibility into fisheries, so I think it's partly that. And then just historically, they have been on the margins because agriculture has really dominated discussions about food and has been at the center of all of our thinking about food. So I think it's significantly that. I think we've also not appreciated just how much value there is there in terms of the nutrition it offers, in terms of the roles it can play in the food system.
Yeah, and we're at a moment where there's, I think, never been more conversations about health and wellness and doing right by that. So it's a natural plug-in for that. Yep. Minister, I think everyone here has acknowledged, made very difficult and amazing progress on a tough subject politically. What is your advice to others who have not made as much progress as you have, who are trying to tackle these issues in their countries and in their communities? What advice would you give them, and what do you need to continue the progress?
Yeah, thank you. I will advise that we should have the buy-in of our leadership. If our leaders have the strong will to give the support, we'll be able to fight and conserve the fish in the sea, or rebuild our depleted fish. And so we should try as much as possible to get the buy-in of our leaders. And we, the policy directors, should also be strong enough. Sometimes, if you are not that strong, you'll not be able to. So you should be determined and make sure that, no, what I'm going to talk about, what strength do I need, what focus, and also bring in the people. As I said, I mentioned earlier, you need the fishers themselves, and that is why you should have this co-management. And on my part, to strengthen what I have done, I think I still need their cooperation, and also continue with the measures that I have started. And to end it all is to make sure that you give them the opportunity to also come out and tell you that, yes, what we are doing, we are benefiting from it. Because in Ghana, when we do the close season, after the close season, we still go back, we do the research, and then we know sometimes the length of the fish before and after, that's the growth of it, and we inform them. So the more you give them the information, you should always give them the feedback of your, actions that you take. When you give them the feedback, then they will continue to buy. So that's what we are continuing to do.
Spoken as a true educator, which is where you started, and we were not surprised to hear that, of course. But that is so true. Sometimes these things are put into action, and then the community never hears back on the progress. And when there's progress, then you're motivating people to participate. Can some of this information that we're going to glean from people who are on the forefront, like the minister, can that help in predicting and empowering the next community? I mean, we are living in a data-driven time. Is that going to, and we'll end it here, Teresa, is that going to enable more progress? And how important is it to report that out and get that real-time data? Maybe not historical data, but what's happening real-time. Do we have the technology to do that right now?
Yeah, that is essential with the impacts of climate change on the ocean. The ocean's changing fast, and it's changing fish populations in ways that we hadn't seen. And it's been really interesting. We have a small program that has partners in Alaska, and using traditional environmental knowledge, both to say where we've been, but to point out how different our oceans look now, has been really helpful in understanding how significant some of the impacts and the real-time changes we're seeing are on the ocean. And then also through some of the electronic systems the minister is implementing in Ghana, it allows for real-time feedback from the fishers to help inform scientists who can make decisions in consultation with the fishers again, because they are the ones who are taking the risks by fishing. They are the ones who have a vested long-term interest in the health of the fishery, and they should be partners in helping to decide what management measures work and are needed in order to protect this resource that they rely on.
Absolutely. And I love the idea of co-management. And maybe when we're talking about partnerships, we need to be talking about public-private investment partnerships and community partnerships, because that really sounds like is the key for especially this topic, to involve the community and give them voice. Thank you all so much. Fantastic conversation. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you. We'll leave that out.